The General's Legacy, Part 1, Inheritance, by Adrian G. Hilder. A legacy is not what is recorded in history books or repeated in song, but what is woven into the souls of those who remain. Prologue, The Old General, the Battle of Belden Valley in the year of the Church of the Sun, 1852. On the eve of his last battle, General Garon Alice Artifex Dendra lay on his belly upon a mountain ledge. The rock was smooth, the retreat of summer leaving it cold to the touch. "What can you see through that thing?" he murmured. "Just about everything that's going on below," replied the hooded mage beside him, not taking his eye from the device. "Is it enchanted?" The mage looked around and Garon saw anxiety in his dark eyes. "No, I call it a telescope." Garon put on a mask of mock disappointment. "But I did use magic to help construct it," the mage finished. Garon changed his expression, widening his eyes in anticipation, and the mage offered the telescope in response. Garon placed it against his eye and pointed it at the valley below. Lieutenant General Quain Marron broke the moments of silence that followed. "I'm estimating 20,000 soldiers, 600 archers, no cavalry or chariots. I think I've found 3 mages so far. And what are those things?" "Big," Garon replied. "I can see that much," said Quain. "They have long teeth," said Garon. "Lots of long teeth, in a mouth that opens very wide. Also claws the size of a man. 6 of them in a line, and they do not look very happy." He removed his eye from the telescope and looked around with a frown. "Food is being prepared, and one of them has what looks like a camp cook in its mouth." The mage uttered some word-like sounds, with his own gaze concentrated on the events below. "Interesting," he said. "Zevite, what are those things?" demanded Garon. "It's hard to be sure from this distance," Zevite replied. "In part they are something summoned from elsewhere. I see summoning magic at work." "Can't you unsummon them?" "This sort of thing's not really my speciality." "But can you do it?" "I'd need to research the problem for a while." Garon's tone sank. "How long?" Zevite leant his head forward, stretching stiff neck muscles, and scratched under the hood of his blue-green robes until he felt he could delay answering no longer. 2, maybe 3 hours?" Garon interrupted eagerly. "Years," Zevite sighed. "I don't think they're going to wait that long before marching south and attacking," said Garon, handing the telescope back to the mage, his eyes still fixed on the clawed creatures. "Have faith," said Quain. "We've never been beaten before, and Zevite always has a new trick hidden up his sleeves." He flashed the mage a broad grin. "There's always a first time for losing," Zevite said gravely, "and they are not tricks, as you well know." Zevite returned the telescope to his right eye and continued to observe the beasts. The one with the cook in its mouth opened its jaw and dropped the body. Soldiers avoided the beast like chickens round a tethered hunting dog, except one who strayed too close and was swiped into a cooking fire by a claw. A commander wearing a peaked helmet with ear guards started shouting and pointing. Unarmed messengers ran off into different parts of the camp as the soldier in the fire, too wounded to move, screamed and smoke began to rise. Another beast, the one nearest the general and his scouting party, repeatedly pulled on its chains. Garon and Quain shuffled closer together on their elbows. They talked while studying how the soldiers were armed and armoured. At this distance, it felt like an after-dinner game they had played hundreds of times. They had done this for real more times than any of them wanted to count. The valley widened to the north from where the enemy came. In the south, it narrowed and deepened. A river ran down its western side. They held on to the hope that the enemy's greater numbers would be less of an advantage there where they would be waiting for them. Dendra Castle, the ancestral home of the monarchs of Valendo, was perched on a low rock buttress at the south end of the valley, in defiance of all attempts from the kingdom of Nearhon to conquer it. Zevite watched the beast break free of its chains. Soldiers scattered as it ran to the fire, picked up the burning soldier, still screaming, and shoved him head first into its mouth. The first beast, chained beside the fire, lashed out at the newcomer with its claws. Hungry, and they seem to like the smell of burning flesh. That has potential, mused Garon. I don't think burning some of her soldiers as a distraction is a sensible move for morale, General, Quain muttered with a smirk. Garon chuckled. Pigs. They smell like people when burned, replied Quain, his smirk fading. We're done here, Garon grunted, then turned and crawled away from the rock ledge. Brown eyes looked out from beneath a blackened leather hood, studying the scene below from the shadows above the rock ledge. The man kept watch on the activity in the valley after the other three men had left. A mage in purple robes arrived and calmed the beast, seeming to control it as it allowed itself to be chained again. Double chains this time. Men waved and shook their fists at each other in anger. None of them approached the mage. Food was distributed to the soldiers. The man saw no signs the general's scouting party had been seen, and no sign of enemy scouts. It was quiet, with just a gentle breeze drifting in from the south. His job done, the scout commander slipped out of the shadows to follow the general and deliver his report. In the light of dawn, General Garon, Artifex Dendra, stood by his horse, looking like a statue already carved in his honor. Before him stood 10 formations of soldiers in an arrangement debated late into the previous evening. Behind him there were 300 cavalry horses, 400 archers, and catapults. Catapults were not new on the general's battlefields, but a dozen spit-roasted pigs tended by cooks were. Standard bearers were positioned in front of the catapults at the center, the yellow sun on royal blue flags wavering in the breeze. Further south at their backs stood Dendra Castle, their capital city, Tranmere, and their wives, children, and hopes for a peaceful life. Garon looked behind and nodded to a man in black armor on a dark warhorse at the head of the cavalry formation. A bronze sun blazed on the rider's shield, and he held a mace in his right hand. Unlike the other cavalrymen, his visor was already closed. The rider nodded in reply. Then Garon faced forward and began to lead his horse up the middle of the field. The soldiers were armed with spears, large shields, and short swords for close formation fighting. In the center of their ranks, Garon stopped, a clank of his plate armor punctuating the halt. "This is the Silver Warrior's place, my friend," he said to Quain. "May you find trouble before it finds you." They clasped hands in the warrior's handshake. It appeared more like the start of an arm wrestle than a gesture of goodwill. "I do like the nickname the men have chosen for me," Quain said. "But is it my armor or my tongue that expired it?" Garon grinned. "You can ask them at the after-battle feast." The general and his mage continued their procession up the field. "I used to be a mercenary looking for adventure to test myself. How did I get this job?" Garon mused, voice too low for anyone but Zevite to hear. "You married a princess, which puts you in a position where a king may make use of you." "She didn't tell me she was a princess until it was too late." "You're softer than you look." "So is she. Not that anyone believes me. If only I'd married someone uncomplicated like your Tanya." "I wouldn't say she's uncomplicated," Zevite replied, eyes wide. "She manages Green Island Castle better than Quain ever could or wants to, yet you bestowed it to him. You could have had your own castle. And I could turn you into a scrap of amphibious pond life. Fortunately, neither of these things will be allowed to happen. Green Island Castle has a great library adjoining ideal laboratory space. Painter and sculptor's room, wasn't it? Yes, the natural light is wonderful." Garon stopped next to his special operators. There were only 30 of them, and they were a very different kind of soldier, wearing metal domed helmets, lightweight chainmail, and leather armor. Each was armed with a long sword and crossbow. Some carried grappling hooks and ropes, others a pair of spears and other smaller assortments of tools. They watched the unnatural beasts in the enemy Neahon army's ranks silently lift their heads, open their tooth-filled mouths and claw at the sky. "How come we don't get summoned beasts to fight for us, sir?" came a shout. Garon shouted back, "Commander JG, look to your right at the 29 summoned beasts ready to go. You outnumber those puppies 5 to 1. It will be like picking flowers for your mother in the garden." "Yes, sir!" The operators laughed, a sound that drew the fear from nearby soldiers like the wind stealing smoke from a campfire. Garon mounted his horse and raised a flag. Cook started to heave pigs off spits and load the catapults. The cavalrymen, led by the Black Rider, closed their helmet visors. From the approaching Neahon army, the 6 summoned beasts leapt forward. The thought of Valendo soldiers as their source of sustenance was forefront in their minds, forced on them by their purple-robed masters. Garon thrust out his arm, saying, "It is time." Zevite muttered something, cupping his hands, then reached up to grasp the mail-covered forearm as Garon hauled him onto the warhorse. The mage spoke again, moving his hands around the shape of the horse, the general, and himself. All 3 of them vanished. Only hoof prints on the ground and the sound of the horse's breathing betrayed their presence. Garon quickly clamped his legs to the saddle and the horse launched into a gallop up the middle of the field through a gap between soldier formations. They crossed the zone where friend and foe mixed in a chaos of metal and blood. Garon watched the claw beasts ripping limbs and heads from their bodies. Rippers would be the right name for them, he thought grimly. The only sounds they made came from weapons and armor being wrenched aside and bones torn from muscle. This is insane, Garon thought as he rode on, forcing the thought and sounds of screaming from his mind. The veil horse beneath him was bred for strength and stamina, not speed. He waited, still invisible, with forced patience for the ground to the back of the enemy army to pass. Few soldiers noticed the sound of beating hooves and divots of turf kicked up by the invisible horse. In the middle of the field, Quain swept his sword from its scabbard. A yellow jewel in the hilt lit up like the opening of a lizard's eye. He saw the beasts that would become known as Rippers cut into the front ranks of his men. Not trusting even a warhorse to face up to them, he ran as fast as his armor would allow towards the nearest. He watched the beast move as he approached, swinging his sword to warm his arm muscles. One man was dealt a deadly blow, and his head, severed by a huge claw, span through the air at Quain. He raised his shield to deflect the head and slowed, waiting for an opening. There were too many soldiers trying to engage the beast with swords that lacked the reach to be effective. "Make way!" Quain cried. Men scattered to the sides, and Quain advanced between clawed arms, stabbed at the beast's narrow chest where its heart and lungs should be. A claw grabbed him and threw him to the ground. Struggling to rise quickly while encased in armor, Quain knelt beneath the thrashing claws and raised his blade to ward off the blows, but he was too slow in turning its edge to make a cut. Another claw grabbed his shield and pulled. Quain used the force to rise to his feet before releasing the shield and retreating a few steps, breathing hard. The Ripper, finding nobody attached to the shield, dropped it and advanced. The silver warrior took his sword in both hands, stepped forward and slashed. A claw tumbled into the enemy ranks. Quain turned like clockwork with the Ripper's movement, taking the second approaching claw onto his blade, cutting fingers. Reversing the swing, he crouched and cut into its kneecap. Oblivious to its wounds, the lame beast limped after him. He stepped back, assessing the increasingly wretched thing the way a woodsman considers a troublesome tree stump. Timing a two-handed swing to avoid a slashing claw, he cut off the beast's good leg. The Ripper fell, and Quain beheaded it with 2 more strokes. Vacant black eyes stared at Dendra Castle as 5 more of the beasts scythed their way through the soldiers moving ever forward. The Rippers picked up the dying, biting into them as they struggled for their last breath, and then tossed them aside. The catapults released, flinging 6 roasted pigs over the Rippers' heads into the enemy ranks. Quain looked up from the Ripper he had dismembered. He was isolated in a no-man's land between the armies created by the sweep of huge claws that now lay still. The enemy soldiers ahead of him formed up and advanced. One-on-one, he was unmatched by anyone other than, perhaps arguably, and argued it was round many tavern tables, the general himself. But the weight of the enemy numbers would crush him. Backing off, he retrieved his shield and joined his own advancing soldiers. Hunting for another ripper, he worked his way across the field towards the river. Still invisible, Garon and Zevite slid from the back of their horse and checked the location of the 3 enemy mages. They were spread across the back of the field, each focused on the purpose of the rippers they controlled. "Where are they now?" whispered Garon. Upon the utterance of a few inhuman words, Zevite's awareness entered the whole battlefield. He felt the creeping flow of the conflict, and his eyes glazed in concentration as he focused on what he was seeking. "Give it 10 more seconds," he muttered. Garon measured 4 breaths, then drew the twin of Quain's sword. Its yellow jewel lit up like the opening of a lizard's eye, and he froze, then suddenly yelled, "I'm not too old for this!" He came back to his senses. With more strange words, Zevite began a show. His audience were the archers arrayed on the field, for, in this moment, the general and the mage reappeared. Zevite directed a bolt of magical energy at the nearest enemy mage in purple robes on their left. The bolt flashed, spread, and melted into an unseen spherical shield surrounding the mage. Panicked archers took aim, mostly at Zevite. Some archers were slain by more bolts of energy, while others fired arrows that bounced away from an invisible shield surrounding Zevite and Garon. Neither man flinched. They had the enemy mage's attention now. With one of his rippers destroyed, he was more able to deal with his new attackers. Garon advanced. Zevite matched his steps, and their prey stepped back, casting his own volley of energy bolts. A brilliant spectrum of coloured light obscured their vision as the bolts battered Zevite's shield, and suddenly they found themselves teetering on the edge of a deep hole. A shower of earth fell to the ground around them. "Hurry!" Zevite called as Garon took out a throwing knife. The mage touched the knife, adding an enchantment, and then Garon threw it. The knife tumbled through the air and glowed as it passed through the enemy's invisible shield. It struck and dispelled the enemy mage's last line of defense, a shield that covered the skin. The purple-robed mage wore an expression of determination as he raised his arms to begin a complex magic. "What's he doing?" Garon demanded. "Something we cannot afford him to finish." The men crouched. "How's your timing?" Garon muttered. A grin spread on Zevite's usually stern face. They saw the black-armored rider break through the foliage on the riverbank onto the battlefield, a cloud of silence moving with him. A short gallop away stood a tall figure in purple robes, sporting messy black hair and thick eyebrows that marked him out as Magnar. He was the architect of Nehon's war campaign and the rider's primary target. The tall mage saw movement in his peripheral vision and dropped control over his rippers as he threw a look of frustration at the approaching rider. With a flick of his hand and a brief word, a fading silhouette full of blue stars became the only sign he had been there at all. With his intended target gone, the rider advanced on the mage facing Garon and Zevite. Behind him, the cavalry cleared the riverbank and ran down the lines of archers, scattering them with lance and sword. Garon and Zevite watched the enemy mage working his next magic, and saw the black rider's mace wind up ready to swing. Silence enveloped the mage, cutting off his words. Then the mace crushed his skull, propelling the body forward into the mud. "Too bad Magnar didn't take this position," Garon grumbled. Commander J.G. lowered Zevite's telescope, half turning to his sergeant. "One mage dead. Now let's see what the beasts do when they can make up their own minds." "Shouldn't that beast be stuffing pig down its neck about now?" the sergeant asked. "Looks to me like it's going after the dying. It's not eating anything, just sucking on them. Doesn't appear the pigs are going to work. Judging by Quain's fight, they don't have a heart to hit." J.G. shouted, gesturing up the field. "Operators, use crossbows. Take out enemy soldiers behind the beast and see if we can send it that way." The operators spread out. crossbow bolts started zipping through the air around the ripper that showed no awareness they were there. A Nearhon soldier took a bolt in the face and another in the neck. The ungainly beast turned, grabbed the dying man and stuck him head first in its mouth, sucked on the body before casting it away and hunting for the next. The operators kept a rhythm going, laying a trail of the dying back into the Nearhon ranks. JG yelled, "Get a supply of crossbow bolts coming up here, and make it fast! You, run!" He pointed at the first soldier he laid eyes on, who sprinted off. Garon and Zevite marched at a brisk pace across the back of the battlefield, moving away from the river. Archers were no longer a threat, but the rear soldier formation turned to face them. Painted eyes of 100 white walls decorating the Nearhon soldiers' black shields glared at them. If so many men could have one mind, it was as if they were trying to find the courage to advance on the general and the mage. Herd mentality appeared to take over, and with little speed and less conviction they moved forward. "They were not meant to notice us or be brave enough to rush us," said Garon grimly. "Optimistic notion," Zevite replied. "I wanted to avoid the alternative. It's a lot of ground to cover." They halted, and Garon shielded his battle mage while he worked his magic. Heartbeats thumped in Zevite's chest. Angry sounds came from his mouth. As the clank of shields and short swords crept closer, the mage whipped his hands skyward. Flames erupted from the ground and spread faster than a galloping Nearhon plain horse to the left and right, blocking the soldiers' advance. Zevite gasped, wiping his hands down his face, taking a layer of sweat with them. In the center of his chest, a knot of tension bloomed and an ache settled over his head like an unwanted helmet. He tried to keep away worries of how soon in the battle the use of magic was taking its toll, as dwelling on it would only make it worse. Marching. Think about marching. One foot, then the next. Feel the surface of the ground under my feet. Feel the breath in my lungs, the warmth of the fires on my face. Zevite took a breath, an uncertain look playing across his face as he marched on to the end of his line of mage fire. They needed more cover. He spoke again, angry, unintelligible words, and with a gesture the burning ground extended right under the feet of another enemy mage ahead of them. More pain rushed into his head and the tension in his chest gave a cruel twist. He struggled to accept the pain, embrace it, but failed. His only thought was to cast it out, but that made it worse, and he stifled a gasp. Ahead of them, a purple-robed mage with bulging eyes and a bald head stood in a transparent sphere with flames licking around it. Zevite had faced him before, and failed before. His plans interrupted, the bold mage looked agitated. Agitation switched to indecisiveness. Should he maintain control over his rippers, pressing them on to the back of the Valendo's army, or deal with the general and his mage? He stepped back out of the flames, faced them, and then raised his hands palms down and started to speak. "We've got to stop him!" barked Zevite. "Run!" shouted Garon. "Too slow!" With a strange word and a flick of his hands, Zevite was gone in a fading silhouette pricked with blue stars. The purple-robed mage dropped his hands and directed his magic at the general. Garon didn't know what to expect, least of all nothing. The mage cursed. The magic intended to tear down Zevite's shield came too slowly. He started to speak again, then felt a push from behind and found himself on hands and knees, his next invocation dying on his lips. Zevite was there with dagger drawn. He hated fighting like this. Stabbing down, he found the ground as his opponent rolled sideways and stood, dagger in hand. Zevite stood and stepped in closer, taking a dagger slash. The iron-like protection around Zevite's skin, the mage's last line of defense against natural weapons, collapsed. He let go of his dagger and reached out with his mind to start the flow of magic, shaping it with his voice and hands into energy bolts. Before he could finish, the enemy mage grimaced and thrust his dagger towards him. A year ago, Garon had helped Zevite off another battlefield after his last encounter with the bold mage. "Can't you just double up that iron skin magic of yours?" "No, not really. It works by... well, it's not like putting on more clothes. The layer only works at a specific distance from the skin." Zevite stopped at the confused glare from the general. Garon had been silent for a while. Shame another magic skin can't start when the first ends, kind of like a second movement in a concerto. Zevite had then limped along, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. I don't know. I'll have to think about it for a while. Maybe by tomorrow? A few months. In fact, it had taken nearly 10 months, and an elaborate piece of jewellery that the finest jeweller on Green Island needed 5 attempts to get right. Now, less than a heartbeat before the dagger struck, the collapse of one magic skin triggered the formation of another from the centerpiece of a necklace Zevite wore under his robe. He was aware of the dagger point stopping short of his chest, and the collapse of the second skin, but his concentration remained. He launched energy bolts from inside his target's shield that pounded and burnt a fist-sized hole through his chest. Charred, bloody gore splattered over Zevite's front, while far more sprayed out of the Purple Road Mage's back. Quain pushed his way through ranks of men making his way towards two rippers near the river. Eyes widened in terror, and some men lost control of their bladders as a ripper appeared to turn in their direction. In desperation, they got creative, crouched into a dome formation with spears and swords jutting out through shields. They held their position like a strange spiked beetle as Valendo's soldiers before them were cast aside with the beast's relentless progress. The ripper took only heartbeats longer to tear through the beetle formation. Quain began to believe the men might actually break and run unless he did something soon. Through the cacophony of screams, clank of metal, and the crunch of bone in the path of the ripper's claws, he yelled, "Make way!" Abruptly the carnage ceased. The ripper stood tall and turned its head towards the back of the battlefield. It paused. Blood dribbled from the end of its sharp metal claws. Its body turning, it began an awkward run, swatting soldiers out of its path as it went. A second ripper followed. Meanwhile, the special operators followed their freed ripper, still coaxing it towards the near-Hun soldiers, with pairs of men alternating between firing and reloading crossbows. Foot soldiers covered their flanks. Some near-Huns fell under crossbow fire, while others, faced with the onslaught of the clawed beasts, cleverly drawn in their direction by their craving to bite on the dying. The enemy soldiers fell back, and the ripper started to cast around, looking for new targets. "We need to keep this thing busy!" yelled JG. He looked around, his group starting to overextend itself in the field. "Better take it across the field to cover our rear," he commanded. Suddenly his eyes went wide as he saw the two rippers running towards them. Valendo soldiers made the beetle-like formation. Crossbow bolts tried to find a mark. JG had his longsword in hand, waiting, timing a swing. The first ripper shifted course and passed by, the second heading the same way moments later. With no time to think about what the running rippers were doing, he turned back on the other ripper and yelled a command. "Get back to keeping this one busy before we lose control of it!" Magnar looked on from the edge of the battlefield. Whatever faults he had as a general, underestimating his enemies was never one of them. Yet he had seen his two most capable battle mages brought down. Hot with anger at their failure and with himself, he forced his will on the two rippers he controlled that had been fighting Quain's group, drawing them onwards to the old general and his mage. They were coming, huge clawed hands flapping as they ran awkwardly on short legs. Soldiers scurried out of their path. Magnar smiled. The beasts would soon be upon them. The great hall of Dendra Castle was built at the highest level of the main keep. Queen Amaria of Valendo stood in the central northern window with a view over the valley. Her husband, Garon, always a better general than a king consort, was out there on the battlefield. Her expression was unreadable, much the same as her only son, Prince Cory, who stood beside her. Prince Coric's wife quietly noticed a twitching muscle in her husband's cheek, the only sign of his inattention. She also observed the others in the room. The ambassador from the neighbouring kingdom of Emeria was there, along with the elected representatives of the 3 city-states in southern Valendo. Prince Cory had insisted the representatives come up here to view the battle and watch their kingdom teeter on the brink. War was expensive, in lives and money, and had gone on for years with young adults never knowing a time without it. No representative had ever been elected a second term in the 30 years since their inception. It was time to make them see the war was real and on their doorstep, to see where the lives and money went. We should have voted for a bigger military budget, one whispered to another. If the Queen heard, she didn't respond. Her eyes flicked across the battle scene, her attention drawn to the only rippers on the field moving with purpose. They were heading towards the back of the battlefield. Mounting head and chest pain forced Zevite's brow to knit in concentration. He drew deep breaths, trying to relieve the constrictive, burning feeling. Catastrophic thoughts rushed into his mind. The battle's not nearly over. What if I can't do this anymore? Zevite thought. What if Garon is killed? These beasts would wipe out our army and march south. They'll make it to Green Island. The castle would never withstand Magnar's assault if I'm dead on this field. He shook his head. Get a grip, he thought fiercely. Garon caught up and stood inside the protection of Zevite's shield. Well, that got him. Not bad at all. Garon watched smoke rising from the hole in the dead mage's chest for a moment. Then they both looked around. Zevite reached out with his now fading battle sense. There was no sense of Magnar, but he had to be out there and he wouldn't be found this way. What's going on? Released beasts are attacking everyone. 2 of them are favoring Neohon men. They're breaking their formations. There's another beast. No, 2 coming this way. Any ideas? Asked Garon. Zevite fought through a treacle fog of head pain and tried to make complex calculations and patterns in his mind. He no longer trusted his judgment and snarled like a cornered predator. Only this! He made angry sounds, and flame burst under the enemy soldiers and spread on the path of the approaching rippers. Pain exploded the flow of magic like hot knives stabbing into his brain, his twisted chest barely allowing breath for the scream. His consciousness swam. Time slowed. Through watering eyes he watched the ungainly run of a ripper in flames. It raised its claws, bared its teeth, and leapt from the battlefield into his mind, a burning nightmare he took with him into his new world of blackness and silence. Garon measured the blazing ripper's approach, then lunged forward, plunging his sword into its chest. He pulled back, hair and beard burning, expecting the monster to fall and die. A flaming claw slashed into his right side, and armor plating was ripped off his arm. Claw blades cut into flesh, and his sword spun out of his grasp. Garon dove after the sword with his left hand. The burning ripper tried to follow its first strike, but the fire had consumed too much of its body, and it crumpled to the ground. Before Garon had a chance to rise, energy bolts pounded into his back, quickly burning through his armor. Praying the unconscious mage still had his invisible shield around him, Garon rolled and crawled for cover. More bolts came, but they melted into the shield. He sighed in relief. 1 ripper remained. Garon stood, sword in his left hand, with half his hair and beard burnt away and his right hand tucked into his belt. The ripper bore down on him with both claws as he leapt aside with an awkward backswing that earned him no more than a minor cut on the unfeeling beast. Garon pushed back against his own pain, then sidestepped and danced around the lumbering beast, attempting to strike it. Exhaustion was mounting fast as he struggled to carry his injured right arm in the heat. Predictable though it was becoming, the beast succeeded in stripping leg plates from Garon's armor. Garon found the rhythm he desperately needed. With several turns and counter strikes, he cut off a claw, unbalancing the beast, before he roared out and hacked through the beast's back in 3 strokes. He quickly moved to stand over the heap of blue-green robes on the ground that was Zevite. Magnar glared at him, dark eyes overflowing with hatred. Staring back, Garon tried to steady his breathing and not react to what he'd just seen in his peripheral vision. He cried out, "Why do you send summoned beasts to stand against me?" The black-armored rider, now on foot, was approaching Magnar and bringing his cloud of silence with him. The scout commander followed, just as silently. Magnar, filled with a human need to vent his frustration, hissed back at Garon, "Because mere men cannot." His next words were cut off as he turned in alarm and fled from the rider, who was almost upon him. Weighed down with armor, the rider was quickly outpaced. Not so the scout commander, who leapt from the rocks and gave chase. A stream of energy bolts raced at the nimble man, who caught one on the shoulder before taking cover behind a rock. Many more blasts created a spray of molten rock and shrapnel. Heartbeats passed in silence. Indecision. The scout commander took a chance and popped his head up and down for a quick look over the rock. Nothing. He stood. Still nothing. Magnar was gone. Garon stood guard over Zevite, sword ready in his left hand, the fires casting an orange glow on the undamaged side of his sweating body. He remained there for hours, unchallenged, before the cavalry carried them both out of Belden Valley. The Nirhorn army lost purpose and courage with the remaining Rippers breaking their formations under the influence of the Special Operators' tactics. Directionless, they fought only for their own survival. As the fires created by Zevite's magic died out, the enemy steadily quit the field. One remaining Nirhorn commander who had evaded the Special Operators all day long led them. A final crunch of sword onto the backbone of the last Ripper, pinned down by lance and spear, brought a strange quiet to the battlefield. Quain raised his helmet visor and stared down at a Nirhorn soldier's body lying at his feet on the broken muddy ground. The soldier had many bloody slashes and puncture wounds across his chest, one of the victims of a Ripper. Quain frowned as he looked at the man's face, sunken and creased like a dark grape dried in the sun, the mouth frozen open in a soundless scream. Poor soul, he whispered to himself. Heck of a day's work, sir, J.G. declared. Yeah, heck of a mess too, Quain answered, looking up. He sheathed his sword and offered J.G. the warrior's handshake. Shame I never managed to pin down that last commander. Ugly brute. He had the strangest beard braids I'd ever seen, said J.G. Look on the bright side. Sooner or later, there'll be another battle and another chance to get him. Quain grinned. Burning the Valendo dead took the few men assigned to the task many days. In line with ancient Nirhorn Whitelander and Plainlander tribal customs, their fallen were left covered over with earth where they lay. J.G. walked the corridors of Dendra Castle, dress boots knocking out a rhythm on the stone floor. He heard Garon growling before he entered the washroom. I look ridiculous! Well, I could shave off all the beards, sir, said a manservant standing by with soap and razor. J.G. leant against the door frame, watching a bold Garon whirl around the room, polished metal mirror in his left hand, right arm in a sling, and eyes fixated on the patch of hair on his lip and chin. A magnificent beard had once hung there. Jay, what do you make of this? Garon suddenly demanded. Quain might have replied with a witty remark involving goats. Then again, even he might have suppressed that urge under the glare Garon gave J.G. It's a very noble look, sir. Intimidating, even. Garon tossed the mirror onto a table where it landed with a clatter. I've got to go up in front of the men like this tonight. J.G. excused himself with a nod and left. That evening, Garon strode into the great hall. He kept his eyes determinedly on the chair at the head of the table as he passed his men, only consenting to look at them when he'd reached his seat. His special operators were among those present, and every single one of them had their head freshly shaved. Those that had beards wore them shaved back to the lip and chin. Garon blinked, swallowed, and drew breath. He raised a goblet of wine in a toast. To the fallen, rest. To those of us left behind, always be a step ahead of your enemy. All but one repeated the toast. As they drank, there was a faint tink, tink, tink sound of a wine goblet vibrating against a plate. Zevite sat quivering, staring straight ahead. It was in the room. Why did no one else see it? The burning Ripper was swiping aside tables and setting them alight with its great steel claws. It turned and stared at the mage with its dead black eyes. It was coming for him.